Christmas, a pagan or Christian holiday, Part 2 by James Dunn. Enter Santa Claus. Nissenbaum states, "Nowadays many Americans believe, as I did, that there was nothing new about the night before Christmas, described in Clement Clarke Moore's poem, that the story was simply an old Dutch tradition brought to the New World in the 17th century and then, in the natural order of things, gradually Americanized." Charles W. Jones argued forcefully that there is no evidence that the cult of Santa Claus, quote unquote, existed in New Amsterdam or for more than a century after the British occupation. Nissenbaum states that there is no evidence at all that there were any Santa Claus celebrations in colonial New York, which had been the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam prior to 1664. Indeed, the familiar Santa Claus story appears to have been devised in the early 19th century during the 2 decades that ended in the 1820s. The Santa tradition may not have even been a borrowed tradition from the European Dutch celebration on December 6th for St. Nicholas Day. Rather, this Santa Claus tradition was therefore a conscious reconstruction of that Dutch ritual and invented tradition. In other words, some brainy writers decided to make up a ritual tradition drawn on some familiar celebrations and weaving together a fictitious character that was acceptable as a real person, if only in one's imagination. That is the art and craft of a fiction writer. If one can create a character that becomes real to people's imaginations, that writer has succeeded in his craft. This character can either be seen as a hero or a villain in people's lives. Charles Dickens' Ebenezer Scrooge was the villain. Bob Cratchit or Tiny Tim are heroic characters in a certain sense of the word. In more modern times, the Grinch Who Stole Christmas takes on the villain turned hero status, as Scrooge did in an earlier generation. But it is the creation of Santa Claus that we want to look at here. This does not mean that the night before Christmas belongs to Clement Moore alone, according to Nissenbaum. In fact, it was the work of a small group of antiquarian-minded New York gentlemen who knew one another and were members of a distinct social set. Collectively, these men have become known as the Knickerbockers. This name comes from the best known of these men, Washington Irving, the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Diedrich Knickerbocker was the nom de plume of Irving in his original book. In his book, A Knickerbocker's History of New York, Irving writes a satirical allegory of New York written in the guise of a history of New Amsterdam in old Dutch times. Irving himself mentioned St. Nicholas 25 times in Knickerbocker's history, including references to the saint's wagon, his pipe, and a line that read, "laying a finger beside his nose," like Santa did when he went up and down the chimney, putting his finger beside his nose. Irving even chose to have Knickerbocker's history published on St. Nicholas Day. Nissenbaum claims that the cultural historians attribute the creation of Santa Claus to Irving. Irving wrote in Knickerbocker's history, "The good St. Nicholas would often make his appearance in his beloved city of a holiday afternoon, riding jollily among the treetops or over the roofs of the houses, now and then drawing magnificent presents from his breeches pockets and dropping them down the chimneys of his favorites. Whereas in these degenerating days of iron and brass, he never shows us the light of his countenance, nor ever visits us, save one night in the year when he rattles down the chimneys of the descendants of the patriarchs, confining his presence merely to the children, in token degeneracy of the parents." Washington Irving's invention of Santa Claus in Moore's poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, helped to transform Christmas. That and larger, more organized police forces, what in an age past in a more agricultural land was seen as a common bond between lord and his servant, had degenerated into civilized folk hiding behind gated walls, fearing the mob outside. The newspapers railed against these mummers, or call it Thumpian bands, keeping people up to all hours, comparing them to the quiet family gatherings and honoring celebrating the birth of Christ. The Calathumpian band came complete with the standard varieties of drums, tin kettles, rattles, horns, and a variety of other instruments. You need to compare this to images of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The prince never became king. He wasn't allowed to. But in their family pictures, they'd be around a small Christmas tree on a table, the queen and the prince and the children all around them, and it was just a very comforting, very quaint image. This is in comparison to hordes of Calathumpian mummers outside making noise and demanding food and drink from people. Anyhow, the Santa Claus story fit into a new, evolving way to view Christmas. It did away with the vagrants howling outside the gate. In fact, the only gatecrasher was Santa himself, who posed no threat and brought gifts to the household. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl of jelly. He was chubby and plump and a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread, wrote Moore. And in a way, the old idea of the reverse social order was still in place. Now only it was the children upon whom the gifts were lavishly given, not the servants, not the workers. Inside the house, the old tradition of lavish gift-giving and feasting continued. Outside the home, greater police forces curbed youthful exuberances that once defined Christmas. The winter festival took a turn but kept on going. It started as pagan nature worship that slowly took on Christian trappings. It evolved through European history and was brought to the New World despite the best efforts of the Puritans to purge it from their society. Today, it is a firm fixture in the American tradition and calendar. The adoption of December 25th as the birth of Christ can either be seen as idolatrous corruption or a way to enjoy a natural season, the winter solstice, and a day dedicated to God for giving us His Son. So what does this time of winter festivity have to do with the birth of Christ? Hardly anything. It has much more in common with cultural needs in wintertime. There is a little biblical connection with the ongoing festivals. Unless you decide to declare it a day to thank God for sending His Son. And then as Romans says, you are regarding the day to the Lord. And according to the Bible, that's fine with Him. Everything else is window dressing in which you can choose to partake or not, depending on whether you have been naughty or nice. But I'm not done with the story yet. There are two alternative ways to view the birth of Jesus Christ. One I'm not too familiar with, and we'll do some more research on the springtime birth of Jesus. He was the Passover lamb. And just as Passover lambs are born in the springtime, in order to be the Passover lamb, he would have needed to have been born when the Passover lamb was. That would be springtime. But I don't have evidence for that. What I do have is some evidence for a fall birth. And I'll give that to you right now. And that's out of Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. It is the woman in the heavens, the woman in the stars. And it says, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to His throne. In Jesus Christ, our promised seed, Werrell interprets literally the woman in the sky. He claims the woman is the constellation of Virgo, and that it pinpoints the birthday of Jesus Christ. Virgo was the constellation signifying the woman and her seed as prophesied in Genesis 3:15. These verses state that the sun was positioned in the midst of Virgo, while the new moon was directly under her feet. This configuration corresponded exactly to the description in Revelation 12 regarding the Messiah's birth. This stellar arrangement was visible in Palestine from sunset at 6:18 p.m. until moonset at 7:39 in the year 3 BC. Now let me unpack this for a moment. We're not too used to looking to the stars for biblical information. But when it says, there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. This was referring to Virgo, and clothed with the sun would have been the sun going through the midst, the body of the constellation, which of course would take place during the day, and it would take an astronomer to be able to calculate that. The Magi were most likely astronomers from the Chaldean, from the Babylonian area. Astronomers, not astrology. Astrology is forbidden in the Bible. Astronomy is the study of the moon, of the stars. So anyhow, the sun would have gone through the body of the constellation, and the moon would have been under her feet. It would be under the body of the constellation and underneath the stars that represented the feet of this. So, according to Werrell, Jesus Christ was born on September 11th, 3 BC. Yes, that places him born 3 years before Christ, but that is a miscalculation of our calendar. And besides, this book was published in 1982, so there was no significance to the date of 9/11 at that time. That all changed in 2001 when there was an attack on the United States. The Twin Towers in New York were brought down, and another plane was ditched in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon was hit. It is not possible to change the date of Christmas from December 25th for the cultural issues stated throughout this article. The Puritans tried, Oliver Cromwell tried, they failed. It is certainly now impossible to designate September 11th as anything else but a day of mourning, even if this literal translation of Revelation 12 is true. So December 25th will reign as the birthday of Jesus Christ, but we should have a clear idea of when he was born and look into the possibilities. So anyhow, Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.